The hall had not been this quiet since the night the Unification War ended. 7 elders stood in their ceremonial gray, their faces composed into the particular blankness that men of the council wore when they had already decided the outcome and were merely waiting for the ritual to confirm it. The torches along the western wall burned without flickering. The assembled wolves of the court, perhaps 200 of them, stood in their ranked positions with the kind of stillness that is not peace, but wait. And at the far end of that hall, just inside the great iron doors, stood a young woman who had been told to wait there until she was called forward. She had been waiting for 12 years. Her name was Zephyr, and she was 19 years old. And the last time she had stood in a hall this large, she had been 7 and her father had been alive, and the world had still made a particular kind of sense. That was before the Unification War. Before the night Alpha Crest fell to the King's Blade on the ridge above the hollowed pass. Before she became something the council classified with a phrase that had followed her across 12 years like a stone sewn into a coat. Blood Debt Ward. Not a wolf of the court, not a citizen of the United Pack. A ward, held in trust by the council's mercy, occupying the lowest tier the hierarchy maintained, just above the space where the hierarchy admitted no one existed at all. She was here tonight because the council had summoned her. The binding ceremony, held every generation when the Alpha King's formal bonded queen was to be named, required the presence of all wards as tribute witnesses. She was not a candidate. She was proof of the court's generosity, evidence that even a blood debt could be housed and fed and given a borrowed dress to wear while watching her betters ascend. Elder Sova had explained this to her that morning in the anteroom, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a man who has spent decades explaining things to people he does not consider worth explaining them to. "You will stand at the outer edge of the tribute line," he had said. "You will not speak unless addressed. You will not move forward of the second marker stone. You are here as a ward tribute, not as a person of standing, and the court will read you accordingly." He had paused then, looking at her dress with something between amusement and distaste. Alpha Crest's daughter, wearing borrowed wool at a king's ceremony. He would have found that instructive, I think. Zephyr had said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that saying nothing was not the same as agreeing, and that Elder Sova had never managed to tell the difference. Now she stood at the outer edge of the tribute line and watched the torches burn steady, and waited for the Alpha King to enter his own hall. She had seen Aldrich Vane twice in 12 years. Once at a distance, when she was 10, and he had ridden through the lower settlement on an inspection, and she had watched him from behind a fence post, small enough that no one had moved her along. Once at a winter ceremony 3 years ago, when she had been close enough to hear him speak to the head of the council and had registered only the particular quality of his voice, low and certain, the kind of voice that assumed the room would organize itself around it before he finished the sentence. She had not looked at him directly either time. It had not seemed like something she was permitted to do. He entered without announcement. That was the first thing she noticed. 7 council elders and 200 wolves of the court, and a full ceremony dais prepared and lit, and Aldrich Vane walked into his throne hall as though he had simply decided to come through that door at that moment, and the ceremony would arrange itself accordingly. He was taller than she remembered from a distance. He wore no ceremonial robes, only the dark formal coat of his rank with its silver thread border at the collar, and he moved through the parted crowd without acknowledging the way the air shifted around him. His face was composed in the way that very powerful men compose their faces when they have long since stopped needing expression to communicate authority. He reached the dais. He did not sit. His gaze moved across the hall in the unhurried sweep of a man cataloging what was present, and then it crossed the tribute line at the outer edge. It stopped. Zephyr felt it the way she would have felt a hand placed flat on the crown of her head. Not painful, not warm. A pressure, specific and located, that arrived without warning and had nowhere obvious to go. Her fingers tightened against her skirt. She did not look up. She heard Elder Sova's voice from the dais, beginning the formal opening of the ceremony, naming the occasion and the purpose, and somewhere beneath the older man's practiced cadence, she registered that the pressure had not lifted. She made herself look at the floor instead. What she did not know, standing at the outer edge of the tribute line with her eyes on the stone, was that Aldrich Vane had gone very still in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony. What she could not see, from where she stood, was the slight tension that moved through his jaw before he controlled it. Brennan Voss, his beta, standing 3 feet to the king's left, saw it. Brennan had been watching the king's face in rooms like this one for 11 years, and the expression that crossed it now was one he had never catalogued before. The ceremony proceeded. Elder Sova named the formal candidates, 5 women of appropriate lineage and pack standing, each presented in turn before the dais, each acknowledged with the specific ritual phrase that indicated the council's endorsement. Lena Holt was named last, and she was named with a particular emphasis that told everyone in the hall she had been named first in private well before tonight. She was striking, Lena. Dark-eyed and precise in her movements, wearing a deep green dress that had been made for her and fit accordingly. She stood before the dais with the comfortable ease of someone who had already measured herself for the throne room's proportions and found them suitable. She said the ritual response in a clear voice and inclined her head to Aldrich with the kind of grace that suggested the inclination was a courtesy, not a submission. Zephyr, from the outer edge of the tribute line, watched the stone floor and listened to the torches. The ceremony required that the tribute witnesses be presented next, as acknowledgement of the pack's mercy. Elder Sova read the names from his register, each ward stepping forward a half step to be seen and returning to position without ceremony. When he reached the last name on the register, he paused, the way a man pauses who is about to say something he is prepared to say. Zephyr, Blood Debt Ward, placed under council guardianship 12 years past, daughter of the fallen Alpha Crest, whose pack was absorbed into the unified territory at the conclusion of the Unification War. She stepped forward a half step. She kept her eyes level, which meant she was looking at the mid-distance between the dais and the back wall, which meant she was looking at nothing. A blood debt ward, Sova repeated, for the hall, as though the title needed twice to settle into the stone. Present tonight as is required of her station. She stepped back. She did not look at the king looked at her. 3 days after the binding ceremony, Zephyr was called to the lower records hall to receive her housing assignment for the duration of the court's preparation period. The ceremony itself would take 2 weeks to complete, during which the court would remain in session and the wards would remain on the palace grounds. The housing assignment put her in the lowest corridor of the East Wing, which was practical and appropriate, and which she had expected. What she had not expected was to arrive and find the door already open, and the 2 women who had been quartered there the previous day already gone, their belongings removed, a small hearth fire laid and lit, and a folded wool blanket on the bed that was not borrowed and did not have someone else's name stitched into the corner. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the room. Mira found her there an hour later. Mira was 22 and had been Zephyr's wolfkin since they were children, which was a bond not of blood, but of proximity and survival, the kind that forms when 2 people from the same broken pack find themselves in adjacent corners of the same difficult world. She had a sharp face and an archivist's posture, having worked in the palace records hall for 3 years, and she had the particular quality of someone who always knew more than she said and was waiting for the right moment to say it. They moved the other 2 to the west corridor, Mira said, coming into the room and closing the door. No explanation given. It was just done. Someone made a decision, Zephyr said. Someone did. Mira agreed, and looked at the blanket and did not say anything else about it. The answer, had Zephyr known to look for it, was standing in a side corridor of the administrative wing at roughly the same hour, listening to Brennan read from a list of routine housing complaints that had reached the king's desk through the steward's office. The item about the Lower East Corridor had not been labeled a complaint. It had been labeled a correction in the king's own hand, in the margin of the steward's draft. Aldrich Vane did not explain the correction. He moved to the next item on the list and did not look up. Brennan noted the page and the margin and the particular quality of the king's silence and filed all three carefully away. The council's midweek session took place in the formal chamber 3 floors above the throne hall. All 7 elders present, with observers from the court's ranking families seated in the gallery above. Zephyr had not expected to be summoned to it. The summons arrived on the 4th day, delivered by a junior council aide who handed her a folded paper and then left quickly, as though proximity to the message might be contagious. The paper informed her that Elder Sova wished to clarify her status before the court's ranking observers. It was phrased as an invitation. It was not. She went. The chamber smelled of old cedar and candle wax. She took the standing position indicated for non-seated attendees, to the left of the main table, and waited while 2 other items of business were concluded. Then Sova opened a leather folio and looked at her over the rims of his reading glasses, with the expression of a man performing patience. "The court requires clarity on the ward roster," he said. "Specifically, the classification of wards whose original packs were absorbed through the Unification War's military resolution, as distinct from wards absorbed through treaty agreement." He paused. 2 of the other elders were writing. 3 were watching her. "Alpha Crest's ward," he said, removing the name from her body with the word, "was classified under military absorption, not treaty. This distinction affects rank within the ward tier. Military absorption wards are positioned below treaty wards, and treaty wards are positioned below bonded servants." He set his glasses on the table. "Effectively, the clarification places you below the rank of palace servants. This is a correction, not a demotion." The records were imprecise. Zephyr felt the chamber's temperature against her skin and heard the sound of the writing in the room, and understood exactly what was happening. The borrowed dress had told her she was nothing. The outer edge of the tribute line had told her she was nothing. Now Sova was making sure the hierarchy had a written record of the precise measurement of her nothing, so that later, when she was gone, there would be documentation. She said, "I understand the distinction, Elder Sova." "Good," he said, and picked up his glasses. "You may go." She went. In the corridor outside, she stood against the stone wall and breathed, and did not let her hands shake until she was sure no one from the gallery above could see the window she was passing. That evening, Brennan Voss found her in the lower records hall, where she had gone to return a borrowed book on pack law that Mira had lent her 3 days ago. He was not a large man, Brennan, but he had the particular quality of someone who takes up exactly the right amount of space in every room, no more and no less. He said her name once, just her first name, which startled her because most of the court had been calling her by her classification. "The council's clarification will not hold," he said, without preamble. She looked at him. "I don't know what that means." "It means an order has been issued that contradicts Sova's classification. You don't need to know where it came from. You need to know that the standing you had when you arrived here is the standing you will keep." He held her gaze for a moment, long enough for her to register that he was not lying, and was not offering comfort, and was not expecting gratitude. Then he turned and walked back toward the upper corridor. She thought about that conversation for 2 days. She turned it over the way she turned over things she did not yet have enough information to understand, examining it from its edges, trying to find the shape of the thing underneath. Someone had issued an order that contradicted Sova's classification. Someone with enough authority to overturn a council elder in a formal session without appearing to overturn him at all. She could not quite make herself finish the thought. Mira had no such difficulty. It was the king, Mira said the next morning, in the East Wing corridor, in a voice that suggested she had known for 2 days and had been waiting for Zephyr to catch up. Brennan is his shadow. Brennan doesn't issue orders. He carries them. You don't know that, Zephyr said. I work in the records hall, Mira said. I see what comes through. A correction to a housing assignment, a contradicting notation on a ward status classification. Both in the same handwriting. I know that handwriting. She watched Zephyr's face. He's watching you, she said quietly. I don't know why. But he is. Zephyr spent the rest of that morning trying to organize the information into something she could live inside. The king had been in the same room with her once. He had looked in her direction during the tribute presentation. He had not spoken to her. He had not acknowledged her existence in any way that was visible or reported. He had killed her father. That was the fact she returned to when the rest of the thinking became too complicated. Whatever was happening, whatever Mira thought she had read in a handwriting, the Alpha King of the United Pack was the man who had ridden to the hollowed pass 12 years ago and ended Alpha Crest's life in the final battle of the Unification War. She had been 7 years old. She remembered almost nothing of that night specifically, only the absence that followed it, only the long cold morning after, only the woman who had come to take her from her room and explain in careful small words that her father was not coming home. Aldrich Vane had been doing what kings did. She understood that. The war had been real, and she had not been old enough to understand it, and she did not blame him with the simple rage of a child, because she was no longer a child. She had had 12 years to build something more complicated than blame. What she had built was a wall, low enough to see over, strong enough to stand behind. She did not understand why she felt, standing in the East Wing corridor with Mira's words still in the air, that the wall was currently being examined from the other side. The document arrived on the 8th day of the ceremony period, delivered not by a council aide this time, but by Sova himself, who came to her room in the East Wing corridor in the middle of the afternoon and stood in the doorway with a folded paper and a look of measured finality. A formality, he said, which was what he always called things that were not. The document was a lineage declaration, a court form requiring her to state her pack affiliation and blood relation for the official ceremony record. The form had a line she was required to complete before the other lines, a line she had not seen on any standard lineage declaration before. It read, I acknowledge that my birth blood claims to the former Crest Pack lineage are subordinate to the Unified Pack's legal absorption and carry no standing, hereditary right, or recognition in the current court's records. She read the line twice. This is not a standard lineage declaration, she said. It reflects the current legal reality of absorbed packs, Sova said. It asks me to deny my father's blood. It asks you to acknowledge a legal fact that has been in place for 12 years. She set the document on the small table beside the hearth. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at Elder Sova and understood, with a clarity that surprised her with its steadiness, that she was about to lose the last protected status she had in this court, and that she was going to do it anyway. I won't sign this, she said. His expression did not change. Your refusal will be noted as a violation of your ward conditions. Wards who breach their conditions can be expelled from the court's protection. You would leave the palace grounds before the ceremony concludes. I understand that. You would have no standing, no ward status, no claim to the court's mercy. I never had the court's mercy, she said. I had a document that said I did. Those are different things. Sova took the document and left without another word. She sat by the fire for a long time after he was gone, listening to the wood settle and thinking about her father's face, which she could no longer quite reconstruct from memory, only feel the shape of. She did not know that Aldrich Vane had been standing in the administrative corridor one floor above her room when Sova walked past him on the way back to the council chamber. She did not know that Aldrich had read Sova's expression the way a man reads a map of territory he knows well, and had asked, in a voice that did not raise itself, what the elder had been doing in the East Wing. She did not know that Sova had told him, with satisfaction, that the Crest ward had refused to comply with her ward conditions and would be subject to expulsion. She did not know what Aldrich Vane's face did in the 3 seconds after Sova finished speaking, because Brennan was the only one present to see it, and the thing in Aldrich's face during those 3 seconds was not anger and was not calculation. It was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has seen a quality they thought the world had finished making, and found it in the last place they expected to look. If the listeners here have stayed with this story so far, what happens next will be worth staying for. Go ahead and leave a comment below with what you think Aldrich does next, because the moment that follows is the one that changes everything. On the morning of the 10th day, Mira came to Zephyr's room before dawn with cold hands and an expression Zephyr had learned to read over 22 years of shared, difficult mornings. It was the expression Mira wore when she had found something she had not been looking for and could not unfind it. She set a folded parchment sheet on the table between them. "The seal is wrong," she said. Zephyr looked at it. The sheet bore the council's formal ward transfer seal at the bottom, and the seal looked correct to her, bearing the 7-ring pattern of the full council's authority. "Look at the inner ring," Mira said. "The third marker. On a genuine 7-elder seal, the third marker is solid. On this one, it's hollow. The engraving is different. Someone used a secondary impression, not the full council's seal. This was made from a copy." "Where did you find this?" Zephyr asked. "It was filed in the records hall under my access level, which means someone thought I wouldn't look closely or thought I wouldn't know what I was looking for." Mira sat down. "This document transfers ward oversight of you from the General Council to Elder Sova's personal authority. It's dated 3 weeks ago, before the binding ceremony convened. If this transfer is valid, Sova had the right to expel you without a full council vote. If the seal is forged, he didn't." She paused. "And I think the seal is forged." Zephyr looked at the document for a long time. She looked at the hollow third marker, which was a small detail, and was everything. She thought about Sova in the doorway, with his measured patience and his word formality. And she thought about 12 years of small erasures stacked like stone. And she thought about Mira, who had worked in the records hall for 3 years and had learned to read seals the way other people learn to read faces. "Who else has seen this?" she asked. "No one." "Does Sova know you found it?" "Not yet." Zephyr stood up. She folded the document carefully and put it inside her coat, against her ribs, and felt the parchment crinkle against her sternum with each breath. "Then we have until he finds out," she said. The false bond ceremony had been scheduled quietly, without announcement to the full court, as a preliminary rite within the larger binding ceremony structure. Sova had presented it to the ranking observers as a procedural formality, a first-stage bonding declaration between the king and the council's endorsed candidate that would precede the formal ceremony by 48 hours. It was a recognized rite, old enough to have its own chamber and its own protocol. Lena Holt knew what she was doing, stepping into that chamber. Zephyr could not and did not fault her for it. Lena was operating within the system she had been given and using the tools available to her. The tools, in this case, belonged to Sova. What Lena did not know, what she had perhaps not asked closely enough to know, was that the ward transfer document that gave Sova the authority to structure this preliminary rite was sealed with a hollow third ring on a copied impression. Zephyr walked into the throne hall with the document inside her coat, and Mira 3 steps behind her, and the guards at the interior door looked at her the way guards look at someone they have not been told to stop, but are not certain they should let through. She walked through. The false bond chamber was an antechamber off the throne hall's left side, access through a carved wooden door that Zephyr had seen but never entered. She could hear voices from within, the low, formal register of a rite in its early stages. She could hear Sova's voice distinguishable above the others, measured and certain, the voice of a man who was performing a document-backed authority over a king. She pushed the carved door open. The chamber held perhaps 30 people, the 7 council elders arranged in a formal crescent, the ranking observers in 2 rows behind them, Lena Holt at the center of the crescent in her prepared position, and Aldrich Vane at the far end of the room, standing with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the composure of a man doing something he had not chosen but had found no legal mechanism to refuse. The rite had begun. It had not sealed. Every face in the room turned to her. "Tia Elder Sova," she said, and her voice was steady in a way she had not been certain it would be. "The authority you are exercising over this rite is derived from a ward transfer document that bears a forged council seal." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously recalculates their position. Sova's composure held. "This is a ward making accusations in a council chamber. She has no standing to speak here." "She has standing as the subject of the document," Zephyr said, "and the document has a hollow 3rd ring on the inner seal." She drew the parchment from inside her coat and held it open. "Ha! Any elder at this table who has handled the full council's impression in the last decade will see it." 2 of the elders leaned forward. One of them, a woman named Elder Farah, who had sat at the outer arc of the table during Zephyr's council summons, reached for the document with a look of careful alertness. She looked at the seal for a long moment. Then she set the document on the table and looked at Sova. "The rite is suspended," Elder Farah said. Sova said, "Farah, you don't have the authority to suspend on your own motion. You require a majority of the seated council and the king's acknowledgement before any suspension can be recognized." "Then let us ask the king," Farah said. Every face in the room moved to Aldrich Vane. He had not moved from his position at the far end of the chamber. His hands were still at his sides. His face had not changed in any way that the casual observer would record as change. Brennan Voss, standing 2 feet to his left, registered the thing that moved through the king's jaw and was gone, and recognized it as relief. "The rite is suspended," Aldrich said. His voice was exactly what it had always been, low and certain, the kind of voice that assumed the room would organize itself around it before he finished the sentence. What was different was the weight he placed on the suspension, a weight that told every person in the chamber that this was not a procedural pause. This was an ending. Sova stood. His chair scraped back. His composure was intact, but it had become a different kind of composure, rigid where it had been fluid, maintained by force where it had been maintained by habit. "This ward came into a council chamber without summons and made accusations without evidence, and you are accepting her word over a registered council document," he said. "The court is watching, Aldrich. The Alliance families are watching. The preliminary bond with Lena Holt represents 3 generational agreements and a stabilization of the Northern Territories that cannot simply be set aside because a blood debt ward walked through a door with a piece of paper." "The seal is forged, Sova," Aldrich said. "The seal is disputed. By the woman who holds the document it was meant to control." A pause. "And by Elder Farah, who has handled the full impression for 11 years and knows the difference between solid and hollow." Another pause, shorter. "The suspension holds." Lena Holt had not moved from her position at the center of the crescent. She looked at Zephyr for a long moment, and her expression was not the one Zephyr had been braced for. It was not contempt. It was something closer to the face of someone who has just understood that the game they thought they were playing was a different game entirely, and that they had been a piece, not a player. She lowered her eyes and stepped back out of the crescent's center. That was the moment the room changed. The council elders who had been watching Sova for their cues looked at each other and then at the document on the table, and then at Sova. And whatever they saw in his face in that moment was not what they were accustomed to seeing there. Sova had always presented the face of a man who was operating within the system he managed. He was presenting something different now. He was presenting the face of a man who had been building the system to manage a specific outcome and had been found out. Elder Farah said quietly to the two elders nearest her, "The ward transfer document predates the binding ceremony summons by 3 weeks. If the seal is forged, the transfer itself is invalid, and everything Sova structured on top of it falls with it." She looked down the table, including the preliminary rights authority. The room took a breath. Aldrich Vane crossed the chamber. He walked from the far end to where she stood in the doorway, and the room parted for him without his asking, and he stopped in front of her at a distance that was close enough to constitute something and far enough to remain ambiguous. And he looked at her the way she had not let herself look at him. She looked back. She had expected his eyes to be cold. They were not cold. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 12 years operating inside a suppression of something that was not rage, and was not grief, and was not political calculation, something that did not have a clean name in the court's vocabulary, and who was now standing close enough to the source of it that suppression required an active, physical effort. She watched him make the effort. She watched it fail. "You could have signed the document," he said. "You would still have been here. You would have kept whatever standing Sova's ward classification gave you." "That standing was built on a denial I couldn't make," she said. "Why?" It was not a question. It was the shape a question makes when the person asking it already knows the answer and is asking to hear it said. "Because my father's blood is mine to carry," she said. "Not his to erase, and not yours to absorb. I am Alpha Crest's daughter. I have been for 19 years, and I will be past the end of whatever this ceremony decides." She watched the muscle in his jaw and heard the hall behind her and did not break the sentence. "You killed him," she said. "I know that. I've known it since I was 7 years old. I am not asking you to be sorry for a war. I am telling you that his blood does not disappear because a council elder needs it to, and I will not write my name under a line that says it does." The room behind him was absolutely still. Aldrich Vane looked at her for a long, held moment, and whatever the cost of what he said next was, she could feel him paying it. He turned to face his court. The throne hall doors had been standing open during the rite, and the court beyond had been aware that something was happening in the antechamber, and the people who had been arrayed in the throne hall for the ceremony's progression had moved, quietly and by instinct, closer to the antechamber doors. 200 wolves of the court were now positioned in the hall's great space, close enough to witness, far enough to pretend they had not sought to. Aldrich walked back through the carved door and onto the dais step and stopped, and the court that had gathered felt his presence settle over the hall, the way the hall had always organized itself around him, and they went still. He looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then, in a motion that the court had no protocol for, that no ceremony script addressed, that no elder had been consulted about and no rank ordered, Aldrich Vane descended the dais step and walked back to the antechamber doorway where Zephyr stood, and he went to one knee on the stone floor of his own hall. The sound the court made was not a sound. It was the absence of sound, urgent and total. He did not look at the floor. He looked up at her. "My war records name Alpha Crest as a wolf of honor, whose pack was absorbed into the unified territory under terms that the council modified without my full consent in the years that followed." His voice carried across the hall without effort, the way it always did, except that now it was carrying something it had not carried before. Those modifications are the documents on the table in that chamber. They are the reason his daughter stood at the outer edge of the tribute line and was addressed by her classification instead of her name. He let that sit in the hall's silence for a breath. Her name is Zephyr Crest. She is the daughter of a wolf I defeated in a war that is over. She refused to erase his blood to ease a political arrangement that was built on a forged document, and she refused it in front of a council elder who had the authority to expel her for it. Another breath. That is the quality I have not seen in 12 years of court. He kept her gaze. I am naming her before this court, by her father's blood and my own choice, as a wolf of standing in this territory. Not as a ward, not as a tribute witness. By name. The 7 council elders were present. The ranking observers were present. The 200 wolves of the court were present. Mira was present, standing just inside the antechamber's carved door with her hand pressed flat against the frame, the kind of stillness that is not detachment, but holding. Elder Sova stood at the council table and said nothing. His gray robes were very precise, and his mouth was closed, and he was looking at a point on the wall above the dais, and Zephyr understood that the silence Sova was maintaining was not dignified restraint. It was the silence of a man whose documents were on a table in front of 6 colleagues, and whose authority to build anything further on top of them had just been spoken away by the man whose court this was. Farah would report what she had found in the seal. The full council would convene. The records Mira had been watching for 3 years would be available. Sova would not sit at that table for the next session. Zephyr looked at the man kneeling on her floor and thought about 7 years old, and the absence that followed one particular night, and the 12 years of borrowed wool and stone corridors and outer edges and careful silences, and she thought about the word formality, and the hollow 3rd ring, and the blanket on a bed that had not had someone else's name stitched into the corner. She thought about all the things she had misread. She stepped forward out of the antechamber and into the throne hall. She extended her hand. He took it and rose. The court did not applaud. Applause would have been too small a sound for what the room was holding. What the room held was the particular weight of 200 wolves witnessing something that could not be undone, that would be in the records of this hall for as long as the hall stood. That would be the fixed point from which every subsequent arrangement would have to measure itself. Zephyr Crest, standing in the hall where she had arrived 8 days ago as nobody, with her hand in the Alpha King's hand, her feet on the stone floor, her name in the air. Brennan Voss stood at the edge of the dais and looked at the king's face, and did not try to read it the way he usually did, because what was in the king's face now was not the kind of thing that required reading. It was the kind of thing that required witnessing, and Brennan was witness enough. Lena Holt stood in the antechamber doorway behind them both and looked at the hall and understood, finally and completely, the difference between a council's endorsement and a king's choice. And she was quiet. The days that followed moved at the pace of institutional reckoning, which is slower than revelation but more permanent. Elder Farah presented the ward transfer document to the full council on the 11th morning of the ceremony period. The seal was examined by all 7 elders and by the court's chief archivist, who confirmed the hollow 3rd ring within the hour. Sova requested an adjournment. The council declined. He was stripped of his chair on the 12th day by a vote of 6 elders, with the 7th abstaining, and the abstention was recorded as the loudest thing in the chamber. Mira was asked to give a formal account of how she had located the document. She gave it in the same quiet, precise voice she used to explain record discrepancies to junior archivists, and then she went back to the records hall and continued working, because the work had not changed, and the records needed someone who knew how to read a seal. The binding ceremony did not conclude with a bonded queen named by council endorsement. It concluded with a declaration from Aldrich Vane that the Council's preliminary authority over the bonding selection had been compromised by the discovery of forged documentation and that the selection would be deferred until the court's full record review was complete. This was a legal mechanism, dry and precise, and it settled the immediate political pressure without requiring anything more from anyone in the hall who had witnessed the kneeling. The witness was enough. Zephyr was given chambers in the east wing, not the lowest corridor, but a set of rooms 2 floors above it, with a window that faced west and caught the afternoon light across a length of stone floor in a long, pale stripe. The rooms had not been borrowed and did not belong to someone else, and the door closed firmly when she shut it. She stood in those rooms on the first evening and let the silence be the ordinary kind, the kind that does not carry 12 years of erasure in its texture, and she breathed. She did not know what would come next with the man who had named her in his hall. She knew that the mate bond she had not understood was real, that Brennan had explained it to her on the 13th day, with the careful, factual tone of a man presenting information rather than managing a feeling, telling her what suppression cost and what it meant that it had broken. She knew that Aldrich had carried it for months, since before the ceremony convened, since the moment she had arrived in the lower settlement, and the bond had found him across the distance before she had ever entered his hall. She knew that was not the same as knowing what they were to each other, or what they would build from here. What she knew was that she was Zephyr Crest, and that her name was in the hall's record in her father's blood and the king's own voice, and that no document could be forged to remove it, and that she had not signed a line that asked her to become smaller than herself in order to remain. Mira came on the evening of the 13th day and sat by the fire that Zephyr had finally laid and lit herself, and they did not talk much, which was their way, and Mira looked at the room with the particular satisfaction of someone who has spent years watching a situation and has now watched it resolve into something true. "He knew your father," Mira said eventually, "from the war. Not just as an enemy, he kept records. Brennan told me, he has a record of every wolf he faced in the Unification War, written in his own hand. Alpha Crest's entry is the longest." Zephyr looked at the fire. "I know," she said. She did not say how she knew. She had not yet had the conversation with Aldrich that would cover that ground, the conversation that was coming, that she was not afraid of, that she would meet the way she had met everything, standing, with her name intact. She reached up and touched the collar of her dress at the left shoulder, where the borrowed wool of the ceremony had pressed for 8 days. These were her own clothes now. She had been given the means to have them. She thought about the outer edge of the tribute line and the stone floor of the throne hall, and a man going to one knee in front of 200 witnesses, and a council of 7, and the assembled weight of a hierarchy that had spent 12 years agreeing on her value. She thought about what it cost him. She thought about what it cost her, that small step forward through the antechamber door and into the hall, the hand extended, the choice made in front of every person who had watched her arrive as nobody and was now watching her stand. There is a kind of choosing that is not a single moment, but the sum of 12 years of smaller refusals, each one the same refusal at a different temperature, and the final choice only feels decisive because it is the one the world can see. She had not gone to the hall to save herself. She had gone because the document in her coat had a hollow third ring, and because Mira had trusted her with it, and because the part of herself that was still 7 years old, standing in an empty room the morning after the hollowed pass, had needed to know that her father's name could not be forged away. She had stepped forward into the hall and extended her hand to the king who had killed her father, and she had not pretended it was uncomplicated, and she had done it anyway. She was the daughter of Alpha Crest. She was Zephyr Crest, 19 years old, standing at a western window in the east wing of the palace with the Pack Territories mountains going dark beyond it, and the Alpha King's Hall's record carrying her name in his voice, and the long pale stripe of afternoon light long since faded from the floor, and no borrowed wool anywhere in the room. The door behind her was shut. She had shut it herself.